Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue to read Night, Chapter 1. We're going to finish Chapter 1 today. So, just a very quick reminder of what happens. Our main character and our narrator, Ellie Wiesel. And Ellie is, I believe, what does it say at the beginning, of a 14-year-old boy. And he's just kind of living his life and he's studying his religion. And they hear whispers about the war, but it all seems far away. And then the authorities kick out all of the foreigners. So if you were not originally from there, they kicked you out. Well, Moshe was able to escape and he came back and he said, listen, they killed babies, they dug pits, they killed us all. It was horrible. Run for your lives. And everyone went, that's probably not real. That's crazy talk. Nobody would do that. And then things started to get worse. They were told they couldn't have any gold or any valuables. They were told they had to wear the Star of David, on their arms. And things just kind of got a little bit worse every time. So as time is going on, things are getting a little bit worse. So it's been technically a couple of years since those stories first began. Not much has changed, a little bit. But now, right when we ended, it says, then came the ghettos. So what this means is that the authorities, the Hungarian police in this case, and the German police also, were rounding up these people, kicking them out of their homes, and forcing them into smaller parts of the city, where sometimes 2 or 3 families would live in an apartment, and they were just kind of all being crammed into these tiny little living areas. So, the ghettos. Here we go. Let's continue reading. 2 ghettos were created in Szeged. A larger one in the center of town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended over several alleyways on the outskirts of town. The street we lived on, Serpent Street, was in the first ghetto. We therefore could remain in our house. But as it occupied a corner, the windows facing the street outside the ghetto had to be sealed. We gave some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their homes. Little by little, life returned to normal. The barbed wire that encircled us like a wall did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt this was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves. A small Jewish republic. A Jewish council was appointed, as well as a Jewish police force, a welfare agency, a labor committee, a health agency, a whole governmental apparatus. People thought this was a good thing. We would no longer have to look at all those hostile faces, endure those hate-filled stares. No more fear, no more anguish. We would live among Jews, among brothers. Of course, there were still unpleasant moments. Every day the Germans came looking for men to load coal into the military trains. Volunteers for this kind of work were few. But apart from that, the atmosphere was oddly peaceful and reassuring. Most people thought that we would remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army. Afterward, everything would be as before. The ghetto was ruled by neither German nor Jew. It was ruled by delusion. Some 2 weeks before Shavat, a sunny spring day, people strolled seemingly carefree through the crowded streets. They exchanged careful greetings. Children played games, rolling hazelnuts on the sidewalks. Some schoolmates and I were in Ezra Malach's garden studying the Talmudic treatise. Night fell. Some 20 people had gathered in our courtyard. My father was sharing some anecdotes and holding forth on his opinion of the situation. He was a good storyteller. Suddenly the gate opened, and Stern, a former shopkeeper who was now a policeman, entered and took my father aside. Despite the growing darkness, I could see my father turn pale. "What's wrong?" we asked. "I don't know. I had been summoned to a special meeting of the council. Something must have happened." The story he had interrupted would remain unfinished. "I'm going right now," he said. "I'll return as soon as possible. I'll tell you everything. Wait for me." We were ready to wait as long as necessary. The courtyard turned into something like an antechamber to an operating room. We stood waiting for the door to open. Neighbors, hearing the rumors, had joined us. We stared at our watches. Time had slowed down. What was the meaning of such a long session? I have a bad feeling, said my mother. This afternoon I saw new faces in the ghetto. 2 German officers. I believe they were Gestapo. Since we've been here, we have not seen a single officer. It was close to midnight. Nobody felt like going to sleep, though some people briefly went to check on their homes. Others left, but asked to be called as soon as my father returned. At last, the door opened and he appeared. His face was drained of color. He was quickly surrounded. Tell us! Tell us what's happening! Say something! At that moment, we were so anxious to hear something encouraging, a few words telling us that there was nothing to worry about, that the meeting had been routine, just a review of welfare and health problems. But one glance at my father's face left no doubt. The news is terrible, he said at last. And then one word. Transports. The ghetto was to be liquidated entirely. Departures were to take place street by street, starting the next day. We wanted to know everything, every detail. We were stunned, yet we wanted to fully absorb the bitter news. Where will they take us? That was a secret for all, except one, the president of the Jewish Council. But he would not tell, or could not tell. The Gestapo threatened to shoot him if he talked. There are rumors, my father said, his voice breaking, that we are being taken somewhere in Hungary to work in the brick factories. It seems that here we are too close to the front. After a moment's silence, he added, Each of us will be allowed to bring one personal belonging, a backpack, some food, a few items of clothing. Nothing else. Again, heavy silence. Go and wake the neighbors, said my father. They must get ready. The shadows around me roused themselves as if from a deep sleep and left silently in every direction. For a moment we remained alone. Suddenly, Batya Reich, a relative who lived with us, entered the room. Someone is knocking at the sealed window, the one that faces outside. It was only after the war that I found out who had knocked that night. It was an inspector of the Hungarian police, a friend of my father's. Before we entered the ghetto, he had told us, Don't worry, I'll warn you if there's danger. Had he been able to speak to us that night, we might still have been able to flee. But by the time we succeeded in opening the window, it was too late. There was nobody outside. The ghetto was awake. One after the other, the lights were going on behind the windows. I went into the house of one of my father's friends. I woke the head of the household, a man who had a gray beard and the gaze of a dreamer. His back was hunched over from untold nights spent studying. Get up, sir, get up. You must ready yourself for the journey. Tomorrow you will be expelled, you and your family, you and all the other Jews. Where to? Please don't ask me, sir. Don't ask questions. God alone could answer you. For heaven's sake, get up. He had no idea what I was talking about. He probably thought I had lost my mind. What are you saying? Get ready for the journey? What journey? Why? What is happening? Have you gone mad? Half asleep, he was staring at me, his eyes filled with terror, as though he expected me to burst out laughing and tell him to go back to bed, to sleep, to dream, that nothing had happened. It was all in jest. Ah. My throat was dry and the words were choking me, paralyzing my lips. There was nothing else to say. At last he understood. He got out of bed and began to dress automatically. Then he went over to the bed where his wife lay sleeping and with infinite tenderness touched her forehead. She opened her eyes, and it seemed to me that a smile crossed her lips. Then he went to wake his two children. They woke with a start, torn from their dreams. I fled. Time went by quickly. It was already 4 o'clock in the morning. My father was running right and left, exhausted, consoling friends, checking with the Jewish council just in case the order had been rescinded. To the last moment, people clung to hope. The women were boiling eggs, roasting meat, preparing cakes, sewing backpacks. The children were wandering about aimlessly, not knowing what to do with themselves, to stay out of the way of the grown-ups. Our backyard looked like a marketplace. Valuable objects, precious rugs, silver candlesticks, Bibles, and other ritual objects were strewn over the dusty grounds. Pitiful relics that seemed never to have had a home. All this under a magnificent blue sky. By 8 o'clock in the morning, weariness had settled into our veins, our limbs, our brains, like molten lead. I was in the midst of prayer when suddenly there was shouting in the streets. I quickly unwound my phylacteries and ran to the window. Hungarian police had entered the ghetto and were yelling in the street nearby. "All Jews outside! Hurry!" They were followed by Jewish police, who, their voices breaking, told us, "The time has come! You must leave all this!" The Hungarian police used their rifle butts, their clubs, to indiscriminately strike old men and women, children and cripples. One by one, the houses emptied and the streets filled with people carrying bundles. By 10 o'clock, everyone was outside. The police were taking roll calls once, twice, 20 times. The heat was oppressive. Sweat streamed from people's faces and bodies. Children were crying for water. Water! There was water close by inside the houses. The backyards! But it was forbidden to break ranks. Water, mother! I am thirsty! Some of the Jewish police surreptitiously went to fill a few jugs. My sister and I were still allowed to move about, as we were destined for the last convoy, and so we helped as best we could. At last, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon came the signal to leave. There was joy. Yes, joy! People must have thought there could be no greater torment in God's hell than that of being stranded here on the sidewalk, among the bundles, in the middle of the street under a blazing sun. Anything seemed preferable to that. They began to walk without another glance at the abandoned streets, the dead, empty houses, the gardens, the tombstones. On everyone's back there was a sack. In everyone's eyes, tears and distress. Slowly, heavily, the procession advanced toward the gate of the ghetto. And there I was, on the sidewalk, watching them file past, unable to move. Here came the chief rabbi, hunched over, his face strange, looking without a beard, a bundle on his back. His very presence in the procession was enough to make the scene seem surreal. It was like a page torn from a book, a historical novel, perhaps, dealing with the captivity in Babylon or the Spanish Inquisition. They passed me by, one after the other, my teachers, my friends, the others, some of whom I had once feared, some of whom I had found ridiculous, all of those whose lives I had shared for years. There they went, defeated, their bundles, their lives in tow, having left behind their homes, their childhood. They passed me by like beaten dogs, with never a glance in my direction. They must have envied me. The procession disappeared around the corner. A few steps more, and they were beyond the ghetto walls. The street resembled fairgrounds deserted in haste. There was a little of everything: suitcases, briefcases, bags, knives, dishes, banknotes, papers, faded portraits. All the things one planned to take along and finally left behind. They had ceased to matter. Open rooms everywhere, gaping doors and windows looked out into the void. It all belonged to everyone, since it no longer belonged to anyone. It was there for the taking. an open tomb, a summer sun. We had spent the day without food, but we were not really hungry. We were exhausted. My father had accompanied the deportees as far as the ghetto's gate. They first had been herded through the main synagogue, where they were thoroughly searched to make sure they were not carrying away gold, silver, or any other valuables. There had been incidents of hysteria and harsh blows. When will it be our turn? I asked my father. The day after tomorrow, unless things work out. A miracle, perhaps. Where were the people being taken? Did anyone know yet? No, the secret was well kept. Night had fallen. That evening we went to bed early. My father said, "Sleep peacefully, children. Nothing will happen until the day after tomorrow, Tuesday." Monday went by like a small summer cloud, like a dream in the first hours of dawn. Intent on preparing our backpacks, on baking breads and cakes, we no longer thought about anything. The verdict had been delivered. That evening, our mother made us go to bed early, to conserve our strength, she said. It was to be the last night spent in our house. I was up at dawn. I wanted to have time to pray before leaving. My father had risen before all of us to seek information in town. He returned about around 8 o'clock. Good news, we were not leaving town today. We were only moving to the small ghetto. That is where we were to wait for the last transport. We would be the last to leave. At 9 o'clock, the previous Sunday's scene were repeated. Policemen wielding clubs were shouting, "All Jews outside!" We were ready. I went out first. I did not want to look at my parents' faces. I did not want to break into tears. We remained sitting in the middle of the street, like the others 2 days earlier. The same hellish sun, the same thirst, only there was no one left to bring us water. I looked at my house in which I had spent years seeking my God, fasting to hasten the coming of the Messiah, imagining what my life would be like later. Yet I felt little sadness. My mind was empty. Get up! Roll call! We stood. We were counted. We sat down. We got up again. Over and over. We waited impatiently to be taken away. What were they waiting for? Finally, the order came. Forward! March! My father was crying. It was the first time I saw him cry. I had never thought it possible. As for my mother, she was walking, her face a mask, without a word, deep in thought. I looked at my little sister, Diaspora, her blonde hair neatly combed, her red coat over her arm, a little girl of 7. On her back, a bag too heavy for her. She was clenching her teeth. She already knew it was useless to complain. Here and there, the police were lashing out with their clubs. Faster! I had no strength left. The journey had just begun, and I already felt so weak. Faster! Faster! Move, you good-for-nothings! The Hungarian police were screaming. That was when I began to hate them, and my hatred remains our only link today. They were our first oppressors. They were the first faces of hell and death. They ordered us to run. We began to run. Who would have thought that we were so strong? From behind their windows, from behind their shutters, our fellow citizens watched as we passed. We finally arrived at our destination. Throwing down our bundles, we dropped to the ground. Oh God, Master of the universe, in your infinite compassion, have mercy on us. The small ghetto. Only 3 days ago, people were living here. People who owned the things we were now using. They had been expelled, and we had already forgotten all about them. The chaos was even greater here than in the large ghetto. Its inhabitants evidently had been caught by surprise. I visited the rooms that had been occupied by my Uncle Mendel's family. On the table, a half-finished bowl of soup, a platter of dough waiting to be baked. Everywhere on the floor there were books. Had my uncle meant to take them along? We settled in. What a word. I went looking for wood. My sisters lit a fire. Despite her fatigue, my mother began to prepare a meal. We cannot give up. We cannot give up, she kept repeating. People's morale was not so bad. We were beginning to get used to the situation. There were those who even voiced optimism. The Germans were running out of time to expel us. They argued. Tragically, for those who had already been deported, it would be too late. As for us, chances were that we would be allowed to go on with our miserable little lives until the end of the war. The ghetto was not guarded. One could enter and leave as one pleased. Maria, our former maid, came to see us. Sobbing, she begged us to come with her to her village, where she had prepared a safe shelter. My father wouldn't hear of it. He told me and my big sisters, "If you wish, go there. I shall stay here with your mother and the little one." Naturally, we refused to be separated. Night. No one was praying for the night to pass quickly. The stars were but sparks of the immense conflagration that was consuming us. Were this conflagration to be extinguished one day, nothing would be left in the sky but extinct stars and unseeing eyes. There was nothing to do but to go to bed, in the beds of those who had moved on. We needed to rest, to gather our strength. At daybreak, the gloom had lifted. The mood was more confident. There were those who said, "Who knows? They may be sending us away for our own good. The front is getting closer. We shall soon hear the guns, and then surely the civilian population will be evacuated." They worry lest we join the partisans. "As far as I'm concerned, this whole business of deportation is nothing but a big farce. Don't laugh! They just want to steal our valuables and jewelry. They know that it has all been buried and that they will have to dig to find it. So much easier to do when the owners are on vacation." On vacation. This kind of talk that nobody believed helped pass the time. The few days we spent here went by pleasantly enough, in relative calm. People rather got along. There no longer was any distinction between rich and poor, notables and the others. We were all people condemned to the same fate, still unknown. Saturday, the day of rest, was the day chosen for our expulsion. The night before, we had sat down to the traditional Friday night meal. We had said the customary blessings over the bread and the wine and swallowed the food in silence. We sensed that we were gathered around the familial table for the last time. I spent that night going over memories and ideas and was unable to fall asleep. At dawn, we were in the street ready to leave. This time, there were no Hungarian police. It had been agreed that the Jewish Council would handle everything by itself. Our convoy headed toward the main synagogue. The town seemed deserted. But behind the shutters, our friends of yesterday were probably waiting for the moment when they could loot our homes. The synagogue resembled a large railroad station, baggage and tears. The altar was shattered, the wall coverings shredded, the walls themselves bare. There were so many of us, we could hardly breathe. The 24 hours we spent there were horrendous. The men were downstairs, the women upstairs. It was Saturday, the Sabbath, and it was as though we were there to attend services. Forbidden to go outside, people relieved themselves in a corner. The next morning, we walked toward the station, where a convoy of cattle cars was waiting. The Hungarian police made us climb into the cars, 80 persons in each one. They handed us some bread, a few pails of water. They checked the bars on the windows to make sure they would not come loose. The cars were sealed. One person was placed in charge of every car. If someone managed to escape, that person would be shot. 2 Gestapo officers strolled down the length of the platform. They were all smiles, all things considered. It had gone very smoothly. A prolonged whistle pierced the air. The wheels began to grind. We were on our way. So as I read this, I want to remind you that I kind of set things up based with this book here that I have. This is the copy that you all have as well, and you are welcome to read along with it. But just know that some of the language is different. For example, in this book, they talk about deportation. And on this particular copy, what was the word they used here? Um, let's see, I can find it really quickly. It was, thought I could find it very quickly here. Let's see here. Special meeting. Tell us what happened. Transports. So, all that to say, they use the word deportation. This PDF version is slightly different. It's a little bit different translation. So some of the words might be a little different. And for that, I apologize, doing the best we can here with the different things. But basically, it's this. Now, Ellie and his family and his community are being kicked out of their homes, but they're also being completely kicked out of the city, a little bit at a time. At first, it was just the foreigners, and now it's kind of all the Jews are being forced out. So, pay attention to the time frame details as we read. I find this particularly interesting. It says, it was not until after the war, and then it was. Somebody came knocking on their window, tried to warn them, but it's not until the end of the war that Ellie is able to recognize what happened. So you have to make sure as you're reading these details that you're following along. It's mostly linear. It mostly goes from A to B to C to D to E. But this point here, it jumps ahead to Z, kind of jumps ahead to the end. So he's telling us a story, but he pauses just briefly to give us this detail about the end of the story. He says that after the entire experience was over, once he survived the Holocaust and the war ended, he was able to learn details that he didn't know at this time, so he fills in some of the gaps for us. He says, if we had known, we might have been able to be saved, but we didn't know. Now I know. Ugh. Okay. Again, this version has this sentence, and in the PDF that we read, it's a little different, which I think is bad because this is a way better sentence. A weariness like molten lead began to settle in the veins, the limbs, the brain. It's just a good sentence. That molten lead, just like that heavy metal, that liquid metal, just slogging through your body, just making you just slow and heavy and tired. It's a great sentence. Just sounds really good. It's really well written. I like it. I don't like the translation in this PDF. Sorry. All right, phylacteries. Remember, they are Jewish, and so phylacteries literally are things that they would wrap on their arms and their heads. They put little verses from the Bible text on them as they study, and it's just this physical reminder of the entire body experience of studying. So it's an interesting word. Say it with me. Phylacteries. Phylacteries. All right. Again, in my copy, the word that's used many times is truncheons. In this other copy that we're reading, it's batons, basically police batons, and they're just lashing out left, right. They don't care who they hit, if you're an old grandma or you're a little baby boy, or just whack and go, 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 whack, whack, whack. Okay. One thing that we've already noticed so far, and we will notice throughout, is the human capacity to adapt. They are told that they're losing these rights. Oh, well, what's a star? Life goes on. You're being kicked out of your house. Got to move in here. Oh, that's terrible. But then eventually there's joy. Yes, joy. They adapt and they adapt and they adapt, which is impressive in our human capacity to adapt, but it's also heartbreaking that situations get worse and worse and worse. And yet our human drive to survive and to find that happiness, to find that joy, it's very, very powerful. If you have ever experienced a terrible trauma in your life, maybe you've experienced the same feeling of like everything around feels so horrible and miserable, but there are these little moments of peace and joy and happiness. even when you're surrounded by a terrible moment. All right, they spent the day fasting. Fasting is the choice to not eat for a certain period of time. Especially religious people often engage in fasting of different sorts. Different religions have different protocols for it. Jewish people have very regular fasting times built into their schedule. So it's usually fasting and praying together at the same time. So he's just saying that they were still religious. They were going without food, for their religious experiences. All right. Once again, my copy here says, "You lazy swine," and the PDF just calls them lazy. What do I call them? I thought it was pretty cheesy. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. But I think it's important because one of the things about the Jewish religion is they do not eat pork. They considered a pig to be a very dirty animal. So what I think is interesting is that let's see here. Get up, roll call, forward march. Yeah, here it says, "You lazy good for nothings." I find that kind of a funny translation, where in this copy it calls them lazy swine. That would be like a super insult, almost a racial slur. I think maybe I'm over analyzing it a little bit, but because of the Jewish tradition of avoiding pigs because they're dirty animals, they're not just being called lazy, they're being called, "Let's get going, you lazy, filthy animals." So I think it's an interesting translation choice that they made in this other copy. Keep in mind that Elie Wiesel originally wrote this story in French. So in order for us to read it in English, it has to be translated. And sometimes there are different translations. So the Bosch, German police, another word for it. The ghetto. You've probably heard the word ghetto. In this context, we're talking specifically about tiny parts of the town where the Jews were forced to live. Okay, so you have to imagine if in your neighborhood you picked out 3 or 4 families, you kicked them out of their homes, and you forced those 3 or 4 families into one apartment, and that the entire apartment complex was then filled with people from the neighborhoods that were all kicked out of their neighborhoods. So there's all these empty homes sprinkled around, but they're all forced into one apartment complex, right? That's the ghetto. Today, we know the word ghetto mostly meaning the poor neighborhoods, the usually run down, usually graffiti, sometimes gang and crime issues going on there. So we use the word kind of like, "That's so ghetto," but in this context, it was not a good place. I don't know if people say "that's so ghetto," but whatever, I'm not very cool. Okay, and then here they are being forced into trains. And so here's a picture that probably looks similar to what they experienced. Literally just carrying their entire life belongings. That's all they owned now on their backs. And they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what to expect. Think about that, being kicked out of your home, the home you've always known, the only home you've known for your whole life, being kicked out, all of your belongings taken away, put on a train, and you don't know where you're being sent. All right, so let's very quickly just kind of summarize the chapter and then we'll finish up. So Ellie's young life was one of religious study. He lived with his family. It was a pretty normal life. But as the war in Europe got worse, there were small hints at the tragedy coming for the Jews. First, all the foreign people were kicked out of Hungary. Then all the Jews were moved to a ghetto. Then, as part of this, they were forced to wear the Star of David. Their gold and valuables were confiscated by the police. They were often treated with violence and indifference, as if they didn't matter, just hit and bossed around and forced to go without water. And they had to, pee in the corners of their church because they were trapped in there. So really just dehumanizing treatment. As chapter 1 ends, Ellie and his family are forced onto a train with very little food, and they don't know what to expect, and they don't know where they're going. So this is one of those weird things where I want to say I hope you're enjoying the book, but this is a hard book to enjoy because it is so dark and it's so filled with evil. But at the same time, maybe enjoy is the wrong word, but appreciate. I hope you can appreciate that the story is well told. So that's all for now. Take care. Talk to you later, ladies and gentlemen.